For today's critical thought, I want to talk a little bit more about numbers and their use in terms of scaling progression. Why a lot of games today focus on low number design, and why you need to make them small if you want numbers to matter both in the short and long term of your game. For as long as games have used abstracted design, RPG systems, whatever, numbers have been a major point about this. It has been a popular and probably one of the most popular forms of progression for mobile, free to play, MMOs, RPGs, all the RPGs, I should say. You start on level 1, you're now level 700. You do 20 points of damage, you now do 7,655,435,200,014 points of damage. But when we began to see more games embrace number progression or scaling progression, I think it's led to a kind of weakening of the system. Now, there's a reason why just about every game over the past decade has become, in some way or shape or form, an RPG. Upgrading your guns in Call of Duty, new parts in a racing game, and more fancier swords and axes, and so on, is that scaling progression is a very easy and it's a very effective way to show the player's progress. I go from doing 10 points of damage to doing 20. I go from 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 5 to 6, and we repeat as often as needed. It's also very easy to scale. Again, there is an infinite number of, numbers. And you can keep going up and up and up, keep adding in more weapons and more levels. And again, this is a very abstracted and very arbitrary way of defining progression. If a level says I must be level 35 to get into it, until I get there, I can't go forward. Numbers provide designers with a very easy to measure metric of where the player is. It's why we've seen a lot of games go for a gear rating system in today's market, and that's a rant I'm going to have to save for another day. But in order for numbers to matter, there needs to be a weight to what they mean in terms of mechanics and gameplay. Here's a simple example. If an enemy has 10 points of health and I do 1 point of damage, that means it takes 10 hits to kill them. If I level up and I now do 2 points of damage, now it will take 5 hits to kill them, and thus cutting the time it takes to do this task in half. When we talk about low numbers in this respect, this is one of the reasons why a lot of developers have gravitated towards this, and more specifically towards the philosophy of low number design. Meaning that you're building the game in a way that you don't need a calculator or any kind of advanced math skills to figure out what's going on. And the reason why this is so effective is that it makes every number count. With the example that I just gave you, if we, let's say, go from, if I do 5,000 points of damage to an enemy that has, 25,000 points of health, it's still 5 hits. It doesn't matter. And this is one of the reasons why, while number scaling is very popular, or scaling progression, there is a limit to it. Because the pursuit of numbers for more numbers eventually wears itself thin. Again, the player, it's easy to comprehend going from 1 to 2 points of damage, 5 to 10. But we're going from 5 trillion to 5,800,000,000,000 points of damage. It's a little bit harder for that to work. And it's one of the reasons why idle games typically have that kind of break-even point, where the player is just like, okay, yes, I'm now in the quadrillions and the quintillions of numbers. And the only reason I know those terms is from playing idle games. Do I still want to play this? Is that pursuit of numbers for the sake of numbers, watching one number go up to watch another number go down, interesting enough to keep playing? And for some people, it is. That pursuit of more power, of more things. It's, again, why a lot of RPG-based systems really don't lend themselves to having an upper limit. But, as I've said many times over, If I swing a sword and it does 10 points, 10 trillion points, 1 point of damage, the actual mechanic that I'm doing is not changing. There needs to be, in order for this to be effective, more mechanics or systems attached to this. Give me unique powers that have different ratings. So it's not just if I do 6 points of fire damage, it's the same as doing 6 points of ice damage, or water damage, or whatever damage you can imagine. And the reason why, again, starting small is oftentimes more effective than starting large is that it gives you an easier to find metrics for how you want to scale things up. If we're already starting in the billions and the trillions, where else are you going to go in terms of balance? Now, of course, a lot of games I'm sure will use kind of like a scale. Like if we go 1 to 1, let's say 1 to 1 means 1 billion to 1 trillion or something along those lines, so that we can kind of multiply those values out. But while that certainly helps from a development standpoint, it doesn't help from a motivation standpoint. And it's why when we look at kind of high-level play, especially around competitive games, one number, sometimes even a tenth of a number, even 100th of a number can mean a huge deal. So I want to take a quick break here. When I come back, I want to talk about two very different RPGs, two very different philosophies in terms of their numbers and scale, and why one, despite having far worse aesthetics and graphics, felt more meaningful to me than the other. But as always, if you're interested in my thoughts on design, then check out my game design books. For entry-level students, we have 20 Essential Games to Study, and then the Game Design Deep Dive series that takes an extensive look at different genres, with free-to-play coming in 2022. Dungeon Encounters and Disgaea 6 couldn't be further apart from each other, despite being part of the RPG genre. One is a game about the flash and spectacle of numbers, with characters doing thousands if not millions of points of damage by the end of the game. It is about that endless scale of more and more power and more ways to get more numbers and that kind of thing. Dungeon Encounters is very much the idle game equivalent of a dungeon crawler RPG. Your dungeon is just literally a set of tiles, and the most art you get are just character portraits over here, and watching numbers go up and down. But these two games are very different in their approach to scale and numbers, and why I found Dungeon Encounters to be more intriguing and interesting to play, despite the fact that there is far more going on in Disgaea 6. One of the big things that they changed with D6 compared to the previous ones is how they've changed the scale to feel more like a mobile kind of game and not so much like the other or the previous games, where everything starts at level 1, you have 40 points of health, you may do 10 points of damage, and it kind of progressively gets higher and higher. You go from 40 to 100, you start doing hundreds, then thousands, and millions, and billions, and that kind of thing. In Disgaea 6, when you start at level 1, you have several thousand points of health already, your weapons are already doing several hundreds already, and it gets, of course, higher and higher. But my problem with Disgaea 6 was that it kind of lost me on the progression when it's hard, again, as I said in the first part, to really measure scale if you're already starting from a high place. If I'm already doing thousands and tens of thousands of damage, why do I care about doing hundreds of thousands, and then from hundreds of thousands to millions of damage? When I start at doing 10, 20, 30, it's a big deal to then start doing hundreds. And the scaling in Dungeon Encounters is far shorter or far smaller, but it feels more impactful because of that. Going from starting out doing 50 points of damage to doing even just 90 points of damage is a very big deal. If an enemy only has, let's say, 60 points of defense, going from 50 to 90 means one less turn it takes to actually start hurting them, and one less turn of them risking doing something horrible to me. Because the scale is also shorter, it means that spikes are far more noticeable. In one of the early treasure chests, I found a ring or something that would say, oh, we're just going to give you 10,000 magic defense, when my character was previously only having 50. So 10,000 at that level is basically just like infinite magic defense. Now, of course, at some point, 10,000 probably won't mean as much. And again, that is the point of scaling, that as you go up, the impact and the value of the numbers is going to change. But if things are kept at a very progressive pace, you can still have that impact going from 10 to 50, 1,000 to 5,000, 20,000 to 70,000, and so on. But if we're already dealing with big numbers with no real kind of consistency, you kind of lose that impact, going from 4,572 to 9,325 to 18,402. It doesn't really have that same impact, and it also makes it harder to care about these values. And it's kind of a flip when we talk about the previous Escadas, where they kept very small and then they progressively get higher and higher. Now, both games are not examples, I would say, of low number design or low number philosophy, but by starting out smaller and working your way up, it gives the player time to appreciate the mechanics as well as start to understand and grasp the progression curve of how things work. Every weapon, every piece of gear has various ranks, so there is a very obvious progression going from the basic sword to the more advanced sword to the heavier sword to this is the sword that does 50,000 points of damage but it costs like 100,000 gold to buy. And this is where you want to be very careful about when it comes to low numbers. Because as you get more and more, or as you get higher up, you still need to give that player that sense of impact. And you have to be very careful not to have spikes. Character goes from 100 health to 200 to 75,000 to 125 million to 500 trillion. It doesn't have that same impact. And it also makes it easier when you're balancing things out to keep them relatively stable. Now, I do want to talk a little bit more about my camera just kind of phase out there while I was doing my arm example. But another major point about why low numbers are good and why they're very impactful is that, again, it allows you to do a little bit more in terms of balancing and coming up with creative powers. In a really good example, in XCOM 2, I forget the tagline for the end of that one. One of the early powers you get for kind of the supporter class is you can let your drone fly over and do 1 point of damage. 1 point of damage, yeah, from the outside, who cares, right? 1. But when you're playing a turn-based game where every attack is not guaranteed, and that enemy has 1 point of health who's targeting one of your characters, being able to just say, 1% chance hit sounds really damn impactful, doesn't it? And again, skills like this, and with low numbers, it allows things that become higher or different to stand out more. So a classic example from a lot of RPGs is when an enemy does a lot of small attacks. 1 times 6. Okay, that's 6 points of damage. But let's say I have a piece of armor that guaranteed nullifies or absorbs 1 point of damage. Well, 1 times 6 becomes 0 times 6. Now, you can have a lot of different ways of having powers and abilities react. And again, it becomes easier to balance when you're dealing with smaller numbers, which can then be scaled. This is why for a lot of games these days, instead of just saying flat numbers for damage, this spell does 645, this fireball does 243, we now do things by percentages. This attack does 75% of your total damage, 65, 225, 10. And then this allows us to do more in terms of having or retaining that value, but being able to do more with it. Yes, this attack may only do 20% of your damage, but let's say it has an 80% chance to do poison, or a 100% chance to poison an enemy. And to kind of begin to wrap things up, returning to the dungeon encounters and the scale example, you want the player to feel like there is an impact to whatever they get. Going from a gun that shoots 2 points of damage to one that does 10 points of damage is a very big deal. Going from a gun that shoots 685 damage to 755, it's not that big of a jump. And again, if we look at it from the outside, 2 to 10, 685 to 700 something, those are bigger numbers in the latter example. But based on the design, it doesn't really move that needle as far. So here's a question for those of you watching. Can you think of a game that did high number scale right, or felt meaningful, to go from doing tens to hundreds to thousands to millions to billions to trillions of damage or value, whatever, and it's still motivating you to play? For me with Diablo 3, I always lost interest when I got to the end game. Yay, I'm doing 80,000 points of damage, and now this new weapon lets me do 82,000 points of damage. Whoopee. It's probably why I'm not that big on Diablo Immortal. But with that said, thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments down below. Do the liking and subscribing as well. Check out our Discord and Patreon, and come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where you examine the art and science of games.